How we doing, geography class? You'll probably be listening to this in the late afternoon, evening, hopefully not the next morning, but if you are, today we are going to talk about United States and Canada and specifically look at human environment interaction. If you can think back to the first week of school, we talked about the five themes of geography. The five themes of geography are location, place, region, human environment interaction, and movement. And I told you during that week that we were going to come back to these five themes when we got to talking about specific places on our Earth. Well, guess what? We're at that point where now we can look at different regions in the world and apply these five themes. We can apply the different theories we looked at in the first couple of weeks and now really go in depth onto these locations. And like last week, we started with the United States and Canada. Now we're going to apply some of these themes to them. I don't know if you realize this or not, but last week when we did the US Maps activity on Monday and the Z Maps activity, we covered three of the five themes already: location, place, and region. And we did that because in Monday we looked at different landform regions, states, capitals, lakes, and rivers. And through the Z maps, we took those landform regions and put them on our own map, and that covered location, place, and region. But now we need to move on to human environment interaction. With the five themes, we all had a specific different question for each one. And if you can remember back to human environment interaction, the specific question that we want to answer with that is, how do people relate to the physical world? Or in other words, how do people learn to use what the environment offers them and to change the environment to meet their needs? And this is exactly what happened in the history of the United States and Canada. At the very beginning, we had people come into the United States and Canada called nomads. That's a vocabulary word because it's a very important term. Nomads were people who moved from place to place and didn't settle down. These nomads would hunt their food and they would follow those animals for their meal and clothing. And I teach that in American history, which you guys are lucky enough because you can take that with me next year as sophomores. But I always get the same question with these nomads, and people ask me, how did they even get here in the first place? And the way they got here was through a little land bridge called the Bering Strait. And it connects between Siberia and the United States up in Alaska. And you can see on this map, when you come from Russia to the United States, we have this little bitty piece of water called the Bering Strait that kind of disconnects these two landmarks. And at one point in time, this was actually frozen. Okay, and what the nomads would do is they would be hunting their animals and they would come through Siberia and they would cross that land bridge into Alaska. Over time, that land bridge melted and we no longer can cross that. We really get into human environment interaction when we leave the nomads and start talking about the colonists that came over and settled their permanent colonies on the East Coast. Another thing that you guys will be able to learn as sophomores when you take my class. It's important to understand that at first those colonists came over to America in order to find gold, thinking that this country would have sidewalks and streets paved with it. But unfortunately for them, they found nothing of the sort. They had to start planting crops to survive, and they would talk to the Native Americans to learn those trades. Another thing they had to do was cut down wood in the forest for homes, and they would plow the soil, and they would dig ditches for irrigation, and this turned out to be the main industry in the South, because in the South, they would have huge plantations where they would grow cotton, and it was a very rural society, different from the North, because in the North they had much bigger cities and urban areas, and we still see those large cities and urban areas in the Northeast today. It isn't a coincidence that these large cities are often located near bodies of water or in places with desirable climates. This is where they needed to start in order to trade. They didn't have planes at that time. They didn't have the UPS trucks. They would use those rivers in order to trade. So most cities, a lot of them, if you look at them today and look at them on maps, they're located near that body of water, especially on the East Coast, because that is where they would do their trading. One example of a large city that shows us in our book is Montreal, Quebec. This city is an area with extremely cold temperatures, but if you look at it, it's also located on a large island near two major rivers. Los Angeles, California is another city that's talked about in our book, and that is kind of has the best of both worlds. If you can see, it's located near the Pacific Ocean, but its zone of latitude is also makes it so it's a desirable climate. We know that cities are great and everything, but what happens when a person in that city needs to get from one place or another? Transportation is a key issue when we talk about human environment interaction. In the United States and Canada, we have three specific modes of transportation that they talk about in our book that don't take place in the air. Okay, and what these are trails and inland waterways, railroads, and the national highway system. The first two, I'm sure you're familiar with, but not that familiar with, because first of all, in Iowa, we don't really have the waterways that are talked about in our chapter. I think they're very interesting, and it's also really cool to see how ships move in and out of these different locks. And what locks are is they are sections of a waterway with closed gates where water levels are raised or lowered, and that's how ships can get from one section to another. The book shows an example of that on page 129. And the example they're showing you is the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that was a joint project between the United States and Canada so they could get the ships from the United States into Canada. And sometimes rivers are hard to cross or you have to cross different sections, and they use these locks. And I'm going to show you a really quick video that goes in fast forward motion, and you can see how a ship gets from one space to another even if it has to go up or down. Another mode of transportation that we talk about in this section is railroads. And railroads are definitely not as popular this day and age as they were, but at one time they were at the top of the travel industry in the United States and Canada. The reason that railroads are so important to look at in the human environment interaction section is because of how people in the 19th century would go about building them. Remember, when we talk about human environment interaction, it's how people take what's given them and how they fix it or change it to meet their needs. And to establish the rail lines, the workers would have to cut down forests, build bridges, and blow out sections of mountain just to get through, under, and around those natural barriers. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that not many of you traveled by train because most of you use the national highway system. And that's the third mode of transportation that's addressed in this section. And the U.S. transportation highway system has 4 million miles of road. And if you can recall, that's going to be different than Canada. And the reason it's different in Canada is because we talked about how Canada is covered half by forests. So the total miles there is substantially smaller than the United States. 4 million miles of roads in the United States, only 560,000 miles of highway in Canada. And most of that is in southern Canada, because if you remember when we talked about climate zones, much of the northern part of Canada is in a tundra climate region where they're probably not going to have many highways. This has been your first flipped classroom lecture, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you were able to take notes well. If you weren't, just go back to the section that you missed, play it over, something that you can't do in class, but you can do on this. You can take notes over what you think are important, especially the ones I mentioned multiple times. All of this information is important. And when you come back to class, we'll quickly address what was talked about in this, and then we can go on to something that will delve deeper into the subject and deeper into the topic, and that you will find more interesting than if I just went through this in class. Okay, so make sure you took notes. I hope you enjoyed it, and until the next video, have a good one.